Belarusian President Lukashenko has decided to expel Russian and Wagner soldiers stationed within the borders of Belarus. The patience of the Belarusian people has overflowed. People who want to deport foreign soldiers stationed within the borders of Belarus have started a riot in the streets. Wagner and Russian soldiers who have started disturbing the peace of the Belarusian people will be deported from Belarus. The decadent war between Russia and Ukraine, which has been going on for 19 months, has now turned into a political war. The war, which also spread within the borders of Belarus, caused a great internal confusion in Belarus. As it is known, shortly after the Russian army began to occupy the territory of Ukraine, a meeting took place between Putin and Lukashenko in the capital Minsk. Immediately after this meeting, Russian leader Vladimir Putin decided to send thousands of Russian troops, armored vehicles, tanks, and air defense systems to the territory of Belarus. Putin was planning to further accelerate the occupation of Ukrainian territory by Belarus by creating a second front on the Ukrainian border. However, NATO countries have made it clear that they will not hesitate to intervene if Belarus becomes involved in this war. The Russian army has not attempted any attacks on Ukraine through the territory of Belarus, but thousands of Russian troops are still being kept ready on the territory of Belarus. With the withdrawal of Wagner's army from Ukraine and the beginning to settle within the borders of Belarus, quite interesting events began to take place. Lukashenko was completely unaware of the problems Wagner and Russian soldiers would have in Belarus. Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko has established several military headquarters in the city of Gomel for Wagner soldiers to continue their training and also train Belarusian soldiers. Wagner soldiers who continued their activities with a joint training program at these headquarters were also training Belarusian soldiers. However, Russian soldiers, whom Vladimir Putin sent to Belarus in the first months of the war, are also stationed in the city of Gomel. Lukashenko made a big mistake by deploying these two groups of soldiers, who are now enemies, in the same city. As the number of soldiers in the city of Gomel began to increase disproportionately, Wagner and Russian soldiers began to be constantly seen on the streets of the city. However, after the Wagner leader Prigozhin lost his life, the Wagner soldiers became completely out of control. The Wagner soldiers, who began to create unrest in the city, began to have problems with the Russian soldiers they were involved with in the same city. Wagner soldiers, who began to gang up among themselves, were even trying to maintain control on the streets. However, the street fight between Wagner soldiers and Russian soldiers in recent days has become the last point that has made the people of the region out of patience. A group of Wagner soldiers who were drunkenly traveling during the evening had a verbal argument with Russian soldiers they encountered on the same street. This argument turned into a big fight in a short time, and the two groups got into each other. This incident caused a great echo on the agenda of both Russia and Belarus. The next day, the people of the region began to rebel against this situation and organize protests in the streets. Belarusian citizens, who began to express that crime rates in the city were increasing and that these soldiers were creating unrest, wanted to organize a protest for the deportation of both Wagner and Russian soldiers. Thousands of Belarusian citizens organized marches with anti-war and anti-Putin banners in their hands, chanting for Wagner and Russian soldiers to be expelled from Belarus. After a while, the people of the region started walking towards the military headquarters of the Russian soldiers in the city of Gomel and asked the Russian soldiers to leave Belarus. The protests that have grown in a short time have been replaced by a big riot. President Lukashenko initially thought that he could suppress these protests by engaging local law enforcement agencies. Belarusian security forces teams wanted to stop this march by placing barricades on the streets in order to maintain control over the city streets of Gomel. However, the fact that the rebellion grew even larger and the protesters became even more angry as a result of harsh interventions made Lukashenko uneasy. Fearing a coup in Belarus, as well as in Russia, Lukashenko made a statement in an attempt to calm the protesters. Lukashenko, who stated that he will soon go to the Kremlin palace and have a meeting with Vladimir Putin, stated that all foreign soldiers in Belarus will be deported. After meeting with Putin, Lukashenko, who stated that Russian and Wagner soldiers would be sent back to Russia and peace would be restored, tried to calm the people. However, Lukashenko does not plan to send these soldiers all at once. He stated that according to the course of the war between Russia and Ukraine, Russian soldiers will be sent last, Wagner soldiers will be sent first. These statements made by Lukashenko allowed the Belarusian people to calm down a little. Although the turmoil on the streets had ended, the people still continued to intimidate Lukashenko by marching. After an hours-long march, the protesters dispersed. Now all eyes are turned to the meeting between Vladimir Putin and Lukashenko Dek. Will Vladimir Putin accept the expulsion of Russian troops from the territory of Ukraine? The Russian leader has carried out numerous military shipments to Belarus in an attempt to win the war on Ukrainian territory. Putin, who sent the praised S-400 air defense systems to Belarus as a bribe, may ask for these S-400 air defense systems back if the Russian soldiers are expelled. After the meeting, which is expected to be held in the coming weeks, we will learn the decision to be made about the Russian soldiers. However, Lukashenko spoke quite clearly about the Wagner soldiers. After Wagner leader Prigozhin lost his life, Lukashenko seems to be dissatisfied with the activities of Wagner soldiers within the borders of Belarus. The fact that Wagner soldiers have started to gang up and start creating unrest on the streets is also not welcome by the Belarusian government. Wagner leader Yevgeny Prigozhin, who died in recent weeks, made very harsh moves against Vladimir Putin before he died. Prigozhin, who first tried to carry out a coup attempt within the borders of Russia, tried to end the Putin regime together with the Wagner army. However, this coup attempt was put to an end through the Belarusian president Lukashenko. Prigozhin, who was taken under protection by Lukashenko after the coup failed, fled Belarus. Prigozhin, who had been living in Belarus for 2 months, decided to withdraw Wagner troops from Ukrainian territory immediately after settling in Belarus. Belarusian President Lukashenko has invited Wagner troops to Belarus, who have begun withdrawing from Ukrainian territory by opening Belarusian border crossings. Thus, thousands of Wagner soldiers fled from Ukraine and began to continue their lives in Belarus. However, the beginning of the withdrawal of Wagner troops from Ukraine was not welcomed by the Russian government at all. With various promises, Putin tried to recruit Wagner soldiers into the Russian army and convince these soldiers to fight again in Ukraine.